The NATO allies discussed options to support freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz while emphasizing that the initiative was not a NATO mission. The discussions comes as the United States maintains pressure on Iran, with President Donald Trump saying that the Strait of Hormuz is now American territory. Well, NATO's top commander, U.S. Air Force General Alexis Grinkovich, convened a video conference earlier this week, bringing together interested allies under the umbrella of Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe at the Chief of Defense level. Now, the discussions had centered on what individual countries could contribute to help secure freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, NATO has been careful to draw a line between facilitating coordination and taking military ownership of the mission. Now, according to the spokesperson of the commander, NATO was only facilitating the discussions because of its ability to bring allies together and assess the capabilities they could bring to the effort. Now, that distinction had underlined the core dilemma facing the alliance. While NATO members wanted to support safe shipping and protect the critical global energy route, any direct NATO involvement could have drawn the alliance deeper into the conflict with Iran. Instead, allied countries had been looking at arrangements outside the alliance to help reopen the strait. The Strait of Hormuz had carried about a fifth of all traded oil before the conflict began in February, making its security a major international concern. France and Britain had therefore led efforts to build a separate coalition of around a dozen countries to help guarantee safe passage. Now, adding to the predicament, U.S. President Donald Trump has taken a hard line on Iran, claiming that U.S. has total control over the Strait of Hormuz and the surrounding region. He said diplomacy had not yet produced what he'd considered the right deal in his view.
We have total control, as you know, of the border. We have total control. If you look at the blockade, we have total control of that entire region having to do with the Strait of Hormuz. And that means well into it, the land areas. So they would love to make a deal, but they're not ready to make the right deal, in my opinion.
Now, Trump had called for greater economic pressure against Iran as Washington sought to curb Tehran's ability to fund and project power through its proxies. When asked whether the focus on economic pressure meant military options were limited, Trump had rejected the idea, saying the United States was watching how the situation developed.
No, not at all. It just means that we're seeing what happens. They have no money. They have no Navy. They have no Air Force. They are not paying their soldiers. They're not paying their police. They have 350% inflation. So we're just going to sort of see what happens.
All right, to discuss the situation forward, we are now being joined by Jane Kinnan-Mont, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the United Nations Association, UK, and a Senior Associate Fellow at the ELN. Thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast. Appreciated. Now, NATO allies have discussed options to support this whole freedom of navigation without getting involved. According to you, can Europe help reopen the strait without becoming part of the U.S.-Iran war? And if yes, in what ways do you think so it'll happen?
Well, European countries and others in NATO are trying to strike a very delicate balance here. But of course, as your report has just shown, that is in the context of a US president who can hardly be described as a delicate man, who is making all sorts of comments that complicate any attempts to be neutral. Now, you know, there is a global public interest in having freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz because not only the oil trade, but so much of global shipping and the fertilizer trade and therefore global food security, they're all tied up in the Strait of Hormuz. So it matters not just for the US and for Europe, but for the Middle East, for Africa, where the countries that are facing hunger are going to have that made worse because of this crisis. But what we're seeing here is an inability to get together coordinated global action to protect this global public interest, because at the end of the day, the actions that set the closure of the Strait of Hormuz in motion, they were precipitated by the US starting this illegal war on Iran. So the UN Security Council has really struggled to reach agreement because Russia and China don't want anything that might allow or seem to authorize the US to punish Iran further. And even within NATO, an alliance full of pro-American countries, many countries are deeply worried about potentially becoming parties to this conflict, because of course it's not just opening the Strait of Hormuz. The same area also sees this US blockade of Iran, and the US is talking about using that in some officials' words, to put so much pressure on the Iranian regime that it could even collapse. So it's a mess, in short.
Right. Well, furthermore, Trump had said on Truth Social that U.S. would begin the most crushing economic cooperation ever taken against any country. According to you, will Europe trust Trump's economic strategy in opening the Strait of Hormuz?
It's interesting because in some ways, Trump is doing things that no other American president has done. In other ways, he is repeating, efforts that the US has made over the years to put pressure on Iran. Now, we don't know if there might be any surprises up his sleeve, but we do know that there's a very, very long history of US sanctions on Iran that have been designed to produce Iranian behavior change. Now, generally, there's not very many examples where sanctions do work to change behavior. You might say they have in the past worked on Iran because Iran's incentive to enter that nuclear agreement back in 2015, the famous JCPOA, it was incentivized by the desire to lift sanctions and get its economy to thrive. But for that kind of incentive process to work, you have to have some basic level of belief that there can be an agreement and that both sides will meet their commitments. Now, interestingly, there are important Iranian leaders, both the president and the Speaker of Parliament, saying, actually, we cannot afford continued war. It's not good for us. And that is really important because the Speaker of Parliament is a key negotiator and he is by no means a kind of pro-Western person. He is one of the hardline people in Iran, but they are sending this signal. They would like an agreement. However, I think there is a genuine concern in Iran that we shouldn't dismiss, that they don't know if they can rely on any agreement with the US. There's a very bad history there, and they just don't know how to get an agreement that would be credible and would last. Maybe there is some chance for other countries to come in and help to guarantee it. But in a world where hardly anyone is willing to stand up to the US president, that's quite difficult to imagine in practice.
Right. Now, let's say militarily Europe does not get involved in it, and diplomacy is the way forward. In your understanding, what would such a European-led mission realistically achieve if they take part in back-channel talks or whatever ways? In what ways can Europe actually help in opening the strait as of now?
I mean, it's extremely difficult because Europe has played a really important role in the past with the JCPOA agreement over Iran's nuclear program, for example. But right now, it is quite hard for Europe to be neutral mediators because even though most European countries have been against the US war with Iran, they are more worried about the potential for Trump to react badly and punish them, perhaps through trade tariffs or through removing security cooperation if they upset them. So I think that is one of the reasons why what we've seen in this particular series of diplomatic efforts, it has been a growing role for the countries in the Middle East and also for Pakistan. So I think really for Europe at the moment, the best thing they can do is to try to support those regional efforts and to show a united front and to keep sending the US the message that, the war is not worth doing and that the regional countries have to be listened to. I mean, you can see looking at that map, the important role Oman has been playing. And yet Trump at one point in the last few days even said he'd bomb Oman if they stood in his way. So all countries are feeling quite insecure. And the more they can show a united front, the better.
Yeah, you're right in saying, of course, Trump has lashed out at its own allies for not supporting in its war with Iran. And let's talk about this. Now, European leaders have argued that the Iran conflict is not their war before, but much is at stake for them. And at the same time, they're already heavily focused on supporting Ukraine with the Russia war. How do you think Europe can actually contribute in the opening of Strait of Hormuz, trying to balance all of that, because they cannot upset the U.S., because that's where the Patriot missiles come in from. And at this moment, when the escalation is going on in Russia-Ukraine war, how do you think will Europeans be able to balance that out? We know that there's a meeting to take place in another couple of days. So how do you assess that?
I just don't think that Europe really has a sort of military vision for the Strait of Hormuz. It's not what anyone is aiming to do. If there could be a diplomatic agreement, then there could be a role for European countries to be involved in demining, for example, or in helping to escort ships, if that would help to reassure insurers and so forth. But there is no scenario really where they are going to go in the context of being caught up in the crossfire or caught up in the war. It is much more about trying to rebuild diplomacy based on the idea that everybody needs global shipping to function and that the whole world is paying costs. So, countries might say that it's not their problem or not their war, but unfortunately, this Strait of Hormuz crisis is affecting everybody, even the people who think they don't care about foreign policy or don't really want to hear about what's going on in the Middle East. They are being affected too, because this crisis is putting a premium on everybody's cost of living and everybody's food prices. So it really is past time that it was wrapped up.
Absolutely. And that's to, of course, for US as well, considering their midterm elections, and fuel prices is something that Trump has to worry about as well. Of course, we'll have to wait and see how that pans out. Thank you so much, Jane, for joining us on the broadcast and giving your perspective. I appreciate it.